The wagon wheel struck a rock, and Clara's teeth rattled in her skull. For 3 days, this had been the rhythm of her life, the groan of dry wood, the snap of the driver's whip, and the relentless jolting that felt as if the very land were trying to break her apart before she ever reached her destination. She pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it offered no comfort against the chill of her own skin. The Wyoming sun was a merciless white eye in the sky, scorching the grasses to the color of old bone and baking the earth into 1,000 cracked pieces. Dust was a constant companion. It coated her tongue, lined her throat, and settled in a fine red film over the black fabric of her mourning dress. The same dress she had worn to her father's funeral a week ago. He had made the deal before the sickness took his last breath, his voice a papery whisper as he signed away his only daughter to settle his debts. "He's a good man, Clara," he had rasped, his eyes already looking past her, toward a final peace she could not imagine. "Levi McAllister. He'll take care of you." Now she was being taken care of, dragged like a piece of freight to a man whose name she knew but whose face she had only seen once. A hard silhouette against the setting sun during a brief, formal meeting. He was a rancher. He was wealthy. He had agreed to take a ruined girl as his wife in exchange for the deed to her father's failed acreage, land that bordered his own sprawling territory. It was a business arrangement. She was the final payment. The driver, a taciturn man named Elias with a tobacco-stained beard, pointed with his whip. "There she is, the McAllister place." Clara followed his gesture, and her heart, a small, frightened bird in her chest, sank lower. It was not a home. It was a fortress against the wilderness. A long, low ranch house stood starkly against the horizon, flanked by a massive barn and a web of corrals. There were no soft edges, no flower beds or painted shutters. The wood of the house was unpainted, weathered to a silver gray by the wind and sun. It looked as though it had grown out of the desolate earth itself, a place built for endurance, not for living. The wind, which never seemed to stop, howled around the corners of the wagon, carrying the scent of dust, cattle, and a profound, aching loneliness. As they drew closer, a man emerged from the barn. He moved with a purpose that seemed to match the unforgiving land, his strides long and sure, even from a distance. Clara could see he was tall, broad in the shoulder, his form solid and unyielding. It was him. Levi McAllister. He did not walk out to meet the wagon. He waited on the porch of the house, his arms crossed over his chest, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He was a statue carved from the same hard rock that littered the fields. When the wagon creaked to a halt, he said nothing, simply watched as Elias climbed down and untied her small trunk from the back. "That's her," Elias said, jerking a thumb in her direction. It was all the introduction she received. Levi's gaze settled on her, and it was not a kind look. It was an appraisal. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, took in her worn dress, her pale face, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. He gave a curt nod. "Go on inside. The preacher's waiting." He did not offer a hand to help her down. Clara climbed out of the wagon, her legs stiff and unsteady. The ground felt alien beneath her thin shoes. The wind whipped a strand of her brown hair across her face, and she pushed it away with a trembling hand. She walked toward the house, toward him, feeling like a lamb being led to slaughter. Each step was a surrender. The inside of the house was as stark as the outside. The main room was dominated by a huge stone fireplace, swept clean of ashes. The furniture was heavy, dark wood, built for utility. A grim-faced man with a Bible in his hand stood by the hearth. He introduced himself as Reverend Michael, a traveling minister who happened to be passing through. It was all too convenient. The ceremony was a blur of mumbled words that held no meaning. Clara stared at a crack in the wooden floorboards as she pledged to honor and obey a man she did not know, a man who had bought her. Levi's voice. when he spoke his vows, was a low, rough baritone, as devoid of emotion as the wind. When the Reverend told him he may kiss the bride, a wave of sheer panic washed over Clara. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Levi looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He hesitated for a long moment, then simply brushed his thumb over the back of her hand. The touch was light, brief, yet it felt like a brand. "That'll be all, Reverend," he said, his voice dismissing the man. He pressed a few coins into the preacher's hand, and soon he and Clara were alone. The silence that fell was heavier than any stone. "Your room is upstairs," Levi said, his voice flat. He did not look at her. "The one at the end of the hall. Supper is in an hour." He turned and walked out of the house, leaving her standing in the middle of the vast, empty room. She did not move for a long time, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade, replaced once more by the lonely howl of the wind. The wedding night arrived with a swift, merciless dusk that bled purple and orange across the vast sky. Clara had not eaten the stew Levi had left on the table for her. Her stomach was a tight knot of fear. She sat on the edge of the bed in the room he had assigned her, wearing a plain white cotton nightgown her father had insisted she pack. The room was clean, Spartan, a sturdy bed frame, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a single wooden chair. It was a room for sleeping. Nothing more. She heard his boots on the stairs, a slow, heavy tread that echoed the pounding of her own heart. Each step was a drumbeat counting down her final seconds of peace. The door creaked open, and he was there, filling the frame. He had taken off his hat, and in the dim lamplight, she could see the hard lines of his face, the dark stubble on his jaw, the weariness in his eyes. He looked older than she had first thought, a man carrying burdens she could not guess. He closed the door behind him, and the quiet click of the latch was the sound of a cage being locked. He began to unbuckle his gun belt, the leather whispering as he pulled it free and hung it on a hook by the door. The gesture was practical, what any man would do at the end of a long day. But to Clara, it was an act of dominance, of shedding the last piece of the outside world to claim what was his within these four walls. He was hers now, and she was his. The thought sent a tremor through her entire body. As he started to unbutton his shirt, his eyes met hers across the small room. He saw her then. Not the bride, not the final piece of a land deal, but a terrified girl, small and fragile, trembling so hard the bed frame shook with emotion. Her hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her mind splintered, throwing her back into another room, another night. The smell of cheap whiskey and stale sweat, a man's heavy breathing in her ear, his words slurred and ugly. The tearing of fabric, a sharp, searing pain along her ribs as she fought, as she clawed and bit and screamed until her throat was raw. He had been the son of the town's blacksmith, a boy she had known her whole life, transformed by drink into a monster. He had dragged her behind the saloon, his hand clamped over her mouth. She had gotten away, but not before his knife, meant only to frighten her, had slipped, leaving a long, jagged scar on her side. The town had not seen a victim. They had seen a girl who was out alone after dark, a girl whose reputation was now as scarred as her skin. They whispered, they shunned. She was damaged goods. The memory was so vivid that she flinched, a small, choked gasp escaping her lips as Levi took a step toward the bed. He stopped. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with her fear and his sudden stillness. He looked at her, truly looked, and something in his hard expression shifted. It was not pity. It was something closer to recognition, as if he were looking at a reflection of a pain he understood. The stoic mask cracked, revealing a flicker of something human and weary beneath. He had seen fear like this before. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. He backed away from the bed, his movements careful, as if not to startle a wild animal. He did not leave the room. Instead, he pulled the lone wooden chair from the corner and placed it near the wall, as far from her bed as the small room would allow. He sat down, his large frame seeming to fold into the small piece of furniture. He was still a mountain of a man, a presence that filled the room, but he was no longer advancing. He was watching, waiting. The silence stretched, broken only by Clara's ragged, shallow breaths. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, his gaze steady, until her trembling began to subside, exhaustion warring with her fear. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low whisper that barely disturbed the quiet. It was rough, like gravel, but it was not unkind. "I'll be gentle," he said, the words hanging in the air between them. He let them settle before he added the rest, a promise that was also a sentence. "But I'm not leaving." He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. A silent sentinel in the dark. He did not touch her. He did not come near her again. He just stayed, a solid, unmovable presence in her new prison. The days that followed were measured in silence. Levi rose before the sun, his movements quiet, and was gone before Clara forced herself to leave the cold bed. He left coffee on the stove and a slab of bacon or a piece of day-old bread on the table for her. He would return long after the sun had set, eat a silent meal, and then retreat to the chair in her room, where he would keep his vigil through the night. He had not touched her since that first night. He had barely spoken to her. His promise held. He was not leaving, but he was, in his own way, being gentle. Left to herself, Clara explored the ranch house. It was a place of ghosts. In the tall wardrobe in Levi's own sparse room, a room he never slept in, she found the source of a faint, lingering scent. It was the smell of lavender and rose, a woman's perfume, faded but unmistakable. It clung to the wood like a memory. In the small attic, tucked beneath a dusty canvas, were two large, locked trunks. She ran her fingers over the cold metal locks, wondering what secrets they held, what life had existed here before her own sentence had begun. In the main room, the large mirror above the mantelpiece was draped with a swath of black cloth. Another mirror, in the hallway, was covered with a piece of old linen. It was a house in mourning, a house that refused to show a reflection. She wondered who he mourned, a wife, a mother. The answer came, in part, from the old ranch hand she had seen her first day. His name was Silas, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose hands were permanently gnarled around the memory of 1,000 rains. He found her standing by the corral, watching Levi break a wild-eyed stallion. The man and the horse were a whirlwind of violent grace, a battle of wills that was both terrifying and magnificent to watch. "He's got a way with horses," Silas said, his voice raspy. He offered her a tin cup of water from the well, and she took it, her hand shaking slightly. "He seems harsh," she managed to say. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "The boss? He's hard. This land makes men hard. He built this place from nothing. You know, him and his brother, Jacob, built it with their bare hands." He gestured with his chin toward a small, fenced-off patch of ground a few hundred yards from the house, where a single, weathered wooden cross stood. "That's Jacob. Got himself killed a few years back, a dispute over a water right. Levi buried him himself, right in the middle of winter. Had to break the ground with a pickaxe." The old man's eyes were distant. "Changes a man, something like that. He weren't always this quiet. He was set to be married once, to a girl from town named Eleanor. Pretty thing, but she passed. A fever, they said, took her and the babe both." He paused, then added quietly, "Wasn't his babe, though she was carrying for another man. Levi knew, still would have married her." He looked from the lonely grave to Clara, his gaze knowing. "He's got a temper on him. Miss I've seen him nearly kill a man for looking at him wrong, but I'll say this for him. I ain't never seen him raise a hand to a woman. Not once. The words were meant to be a comfort, but they landed like stones in Clara's stomach. It did not soothe her to know that her husband was capable of such violence, even if it was not directed at her. It only confirmed that a beast lived inside him, one that was merely sleeping for now. He was a man shaped by death and betrayal, a man who had bled for this land. What would he do to her if she ever truly defied him? That night, after Levi had taken up his usual station in the chair, his breathing falling into the slow, even rhythm of sleep, Clara slipped out of bed. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet. She retrieved her small, leather-bound diary and a nub of a pencil from her trunk. It was the one thing that was entirely hers, a place for the words she could not speak. Huddled under a single thin blanket, with the lamplight turned down so low it was barely a flicker, she began to write. October 12th, 1875. Another day has passed in this silent house. The wind never stops. Sometimes I think it is the only living thing out here besides the cattle and the hawks. He watches me. I feel his eyes on me even when he is not in the room. He says nothing. He asks for nothing. He has kept his word. He has not laid a hand on me. He sleeps in the chair every night. The old man, Silas, told me of his past, of a brother dead in the dirt and a woman who betrayed him. He thinks this explains the man's hardness. He thinks I should see kindness in his restraint, but I do not. I see a cage. His gentleness is just another kind of bar. He is waiting. All men wait. They are patient when they want something. My father was patient as he waited for me to be old enough to be sold. The boy in town was patient, waiting for a dark night. This man is no different. He is just better at hiding the monster. He thinks his silence will earn my trust. He thinks that by leaving me untouched, he will soothe the wounded animal. But I am not an animal to be tamed. I am not a horse to be broken. His kindness is a lie, a mask he wears. I will not be fooled by it. I will not forget what a man's touch feels like when the kindness runs out. He can whisper his promises in the dark. He can pretend to be my protector, but I will not trust him. I will not. She closed the book, the words a silent vow in the vast, empty darkness of the Wyoming night. Across the room, Levi McAllister shifted in his sleep, a quiet sigh escaping his lips, the sound of a man haunted by ghosts of his own. The idleness was a sickness. Clara had never been one for sitting still, and in the echoing silence of the ranch house, her thoughts turned inward, circling her fears like vultures. She had to do something, anything, to feel like more than just a piece of property waiting for its owner. She decided she would work. She was a rancher's wife now, and a wife had duties. She started with the chicken coop, a small, dusty structure behind the house. The work was simple enough, but her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and kneading dough, were soft and clumsy. She fumbled with the latch on a roll of wire meant for patching a hole in the fence. It was coiled tight, a spring-loaded serpent of rust and metal. As she struggled to unspool a section, the wire sprang back with vicious speed. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, as a barb tore across the palm of her left hand. The cut was deep, a ragged gash that welled with dark blood immediately. A wave of dizziness washed over her at the sight. She pressed her other hand against the wound, but the blood seeped between her fingers, dripping onto the dusty ground in small, crimson flowers. She had failed at the simplest of tasks. Shamed and hurt, she stumbled back toward the house, cradling her injured hand. Levi was crossing the yard, leading his horse toward the trough. He saw her before she saw him, and his long strides closed the distance between them in seconds. He said nothing, his face a hard mask, but his eyes darted from her pale face to the blood dripping from her hand. Before she could protest, he took her arm, his grip firm but not rough, and led her into the house. He sat her down in a chair at the kitchen table. From a cabinet, he produced a bottle of whiskey, a clean rag, and a small tin of salve. He poured a little of the liquor onto the rag, the sharp scent stinging her nostrils. "This will burn," was all he said. His touch was the most startling thing. His hands were large and calloused, ridged with the scars of hard labor. Yet they were impossibly steady as he took her small, trembling hand in his. He held it gently, his thumb anchoring her wrist as he began to clean the wound. She braced for the pain, for the rough handling she expected, but it never came. He was methodical, his movements precise and careful. When the whiskey touched the raw flesh, she hissed, a tear leaking from the corner of her eye. But he did not stop. He simply held her hand a little tighter, a silent, grounding pressure until the worst of the sting had passed. He examined the cut, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It is clean, no metal left in it." His voice was a low rumble. He applied the greasy salve with the tip of his finger, his touch so light it was barely there. Then he wrapped her hand in a strip of clean linen, his knots firm and efficient. The entire time, he did not look at her face. His focus was entirely on her hand, on the task of mending what was broken. When he was finished, he released her. The warmth of his touch lingered on her skin. She looked down at her bandaged hand, then up at him. He was already turning away, washing his own hands in the basin by the door. "Leave the wire," he said, his back to her. "I will fix the fence." He left the house without another word. Clara sat at the table, staring at the white bandage against her skin. It was the longest he had ever touched her, and in his touch there had been no threat, no demand. There had been only a quiet, unexpected gentleness. The contradiction was a seed of confusion planted in the barren soil of her fear. A silent language began to grow between them in the weeks that followed. It was a language of actions, not words. One afternoon, Clara came downstairs to find a rocking chair by the fireplace where there had not been one before. It was newly made, the pine wood smooth and pale, sanded to a soft finish. It smelled of the forest. She knew without asking that he had built it. He never mentioned it, and she never thanked him. But every evening, she would sit in it, the gentle rhythm a small comfort in the vast stillness of the house. In return, she began to tend to his things. She found a pile of his work shirts, torn at the elbow or ripped at the seam. She took them, and with her nimble fingers, she mended them. Her stitches were small and perfect, a neat line of order against the chaos of the worn fabric. She would fold the mended shirts and leave them on his bed, the one he never used. He never acknowledged her work, but she noticed he always wore the mended shirts first. It was a conversation held in wood and thread, a fragile truce in a silent war. The truce was shattered by the outside world. Winter was setting in, and a trip to the trading post in the nearest settlement, a dusty collection of buildings called Dry Creek, was necessary for supplies. Levi announced it at breakfast, his words clipped and practical. "We are going to town. Be ready in an hour." The thought of facing people, of leaving the desolate safety of the ranch, filled Clara with a cold dread. But to refuse was not an option. She put on her best dress, the gray wool that still felt too fine for this life, and climbed onto the wagon seat beside him. The ride was long and silent, the landscape a blur of brown and gray. Dry Creek was little more than a single dirt street lined with a saloon, a blacksmith, and the trading post. The moment they stepped through the door of the general store, Clara felt the eyes on her. The whispers started almost immediately, slithering through the air like snakes in the grass. "That's him, McAllister." "And that's the girl he bought, the one from Willow Creek." "Heard she was ruined, damaged goods." "Look at her, pale as a ghost, got that haunted look." The words were knives, each one twisting in the old wound of her shame. She kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards, her hands clenched at her sides, wishing the earth would open up and swallow her whole. She could feel Levi's presence beside her, a wall of silent fury. His body had gone rigid, his jaw set like granite. He placed their list of supplies on the counter, his voice dangerously low. Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. As the storekeeper measured out the flour, a large, beefy man named Jebediah Fuller, who had been drinking in the saloon, swaggered over. He reeked of whiskey and self-importance. He leered at Clara, his eyes crawling over her in a way that made her skin feel filthy. Well now, McAllister, Jebediah drawled, a smirk on his face. Heard you finally bought yourself a wife, though I also heard the merchandise was already used. The air in the store crackled. Every sound ceased. Levi turned his head slowly, his storm-gray eyes locking onto Jebediah. The look in them was flat, cold, and utterly terrifying. It was the look of a man who had seen death and was not afraid to create it. You will step outside, Levi said. It was not a request. Now hold on, the storekeeper stammered, his eyes wide. But Levi was already moving. He grabbed Jebediah by the front of his shirt, lifting the bigger man half off his feet, and dragged him out into the dusty street. Clara followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. What happened next was a blur of brutal, efficient violence. Levi slammed Jebediah against the wall of the trading post, the impact shaking the wooden building. He drew back his fist, a hammer of bone and sinew, and for a moment, Clara was sure she was about to witness a murder. The raw, unrestrained rage emanating from him was a physical force. But then, his eyes met hers over Jebediah's cowering form. He saw her standing there, her hand flying to her mouth, her face a mask of shock and a familiar, deep-seated terror. The violence in his expression faltered, replaced by a look of pained recognition. He saw that his rage, meant to protect her, was frightening her just as much as the man he was about to destroy. His fist, which had been poised to strike, slowly uncurled. With a guttural sound of disgust, he shoved Jebediah away. The man crumpled to the ground, sobbing and sputtering in the dirt. If you ever speak her name again, Levi's voice was a ragged whisper, full of barely contained violence, I will finish this. He turned away from the man on the ground, his chest heaving, and walked back to Clara. He took her by the elbow, his touch now feeling like a restraint, and led her back to the wagon. He loaded their supplies in a tense, furious silence and drove them home, the horses sensing his anger and moving at a punishing pace. That night, the dam of Clara's silence broke. Levi had taken his customary seat in the chair in her room, the air thick with the unspoken events of the day. She had been sitting on the bed, trembling, not from cold, but from a rage that was so new and foreign it felt like poison in her veins. She stood up, her small frame rigid. Was that for me? She finally spat, her voice shaking. That display in town? Was that supposed to make me feel safe, protected? He looked at her, his face grim in the lamplight. He insulted you. And you think beating a man to a pulp is the answer? She cried, her voice rising. Do you think that showing me the monster that lives inside of you is some kind of kindness? All you did was prove what I already knew, that you are just like them, violent, dangerous. You pretend to be gentle, you build me a chair, you bandage my hand, but it is all a lie. It is a way to control me, to tame me, until I am ready for you to truly claim me. He stood up then, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought she had pushed him too far. He took a step toward her, and she flinched back, a small, involuntary movement. The sight of her fear stopped him cold. The anger drained from his face, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound it seemed to age him before her eyes. Tame you? He said, his voice rough with a weary disbelief. Clara, I am not trying to tame you. I am just trying to survive the winter with you. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of pure frustration. That man in town, what he said was wrong, and out here, there is only one way to answer that kind of wrong. I stopped. For you, I stopped. The raw honesty in his voice chipped away at her anger, leaving her feeling hollow and confused. He sank back into the chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He looked at the floor, his gaze turned inward, to a place of profound grief. "This ranch," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "My brother Jacob and I. We built it from nothing. The deed was just paper. The reality was rocks and snakes and winters that could freeze a man's soul. We fought for every acre." He looked up, and his eyes were filled with a bleakness that mirrored the landscape outside their window. "We had to bleed for this land. I mean that Jacob, he bled his life into this ground over a trickle of water in a dry creek bed. I was the one who found him. I was the one who carried him home. And I was the one who dug his grave in the frozen earth with a pickaxe because the ground was too hard for a shovel." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "This land never gave me anything I didn't have to bleed for. My brother, the woman I was to marry, everything I have ever tried to hold on to, it has taken from me. I am not pretending to be kind. Clara, I am just tired. I am tired of fighting. I am tired of losing." His confession hung in the air between them, a raw, aching truth that stripped away the stoic rancher and revealed the broken man beneath. He, too, was a survivor of a different kind of violence. He, too, was scarred. A week later, the sky turned a bruised purple gray, and a storm rolled in from the north, a great beast of wind and snow. For 3 days, they were trapped inside the house, the world reduced to the 4 walls of the ranch and the howling gale outside. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the windows in their frames and driving snow into every tiny crack. On the second night, a bolt of lightning struck a tall pine on the ridge, the crack of thunder that followed so loud it shook the very foundations of the house. The sound was like a gunshot, a violent explosion in the claustrophobic quiet. Clara screamed. It was not a conscious act. The sound was ripped from her throat as her mind plunged back into the darkness behind the saloon. The sudden, violent noise, the feeling of being trapped, it all came rushing back. She curled into a tight ball on her bed, her hands over her ears, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. She was drowning in the memory, the past more real than the present. In an instant, Levi was there. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed. He did not speak. He simply reached out and gathered her into his arms, pulling her against his chest. His embrace was not threatening. It was solid, grounding, a shield against the storm inside and out. He held her firmly, one hand stroking her hair, the other rubbing circles on her back. "You are safe," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against her ear. It was only the thunder. "I am here. You are safe." She fought him for a moment, her fists clenched against his chest, her body rigid with the instinct to flee. But the storm outside raged on, and the storm inside her was exhausting. His arms were warm, his heartbeat a steady, solid rhythm beneath her cheek. He smelled of wood smoke and leather and the cold night air. He just held her, whispering the same words over and over, a calming litany against her terror. Slowly, the panic receded, like a tide going out. The rigid lines of her body softened, and the choked sobs quieted into ragged breaths. She did not pull away. For the first time, she leaned into his embrace, accepting the comfort he offered. She let him hold her, a stranger who was her husband, a man she had vowed not to trust, and for the first time since she could remember, she felt something akin to safety. The tension between them shifted after the storm. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a new, fragile awareness. They moved around each other with a careful grace, their unspoken language now including small, fleeting glances. One night, after the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a pristine, silent white, they sat by the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, the only light in the quiet room. Clara was in a rocking chair, and Levi was on the hearth, staring into the fire. The shared intimacy of the storm lingered in the air, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He turned his head and looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering light. The air grew thick, charged with a sudden, palpable tension. He stood up and walked over to her, his movements slow, deliberate. He knelt before her chair, so his face was level with hers. He did not touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. He raised a hand, his fingers hesitating just inches from her cheek. It was a silent question. She did not answer, but she did not pull away. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Slowly, he leaned in, his gaze locked on hers, and she knew he was going to kiss her. Her own eyes fluttered shut. She felt the soft brush of his breath against her lips, a hesitant, gentle touch, but then the ghosts returned. The memory of another man's breath, foul with whiskey. The feeling of being trapped, of being taken. A violent tremor ran through her, and she flinched back, her eyes snapping open, her body instinctively recoiling from the touch she had, for a moment, been willing to accept. The hurt in his eyes was swift and deep, a shadow passing over his face, but he did not get angry. He simply pulled back, the space between them once again a chasm. He rose to his feet, his expression settling back into its familiar stoic mask, but she could see the effort it took. He looked down at her, a world of frustration and a surprising amount of patience in his gaze. He backed away, retreating to the other side of the room, giving her the space she so clearly needed. "I'm not leaving," he whispered, the words a rough, painful promise in the quiet of the night. "Not even if it hurts." The world grew smaller and colder. Winter seized the land with a merciless grip, burying the scorched fields under a deep, silent blanket of snow. The howling wind was a constant sermon, preaching a gospel of isolation. For days on end, Clara saw nothing but the four walls of the house, the gray-white expanse of the yard, and the hulking shape of the barn against a bruised sky. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. In this shrinking world, she began to see Levi more clearly. She noticed the small things, the quiet sacrifices made without a word of announcement, when they sat for their silent suppers. His portion of salted pork was always smaller than hers. When the firewood ran low and he spent an entire day chopping more, his face gray with exhaustion, he would insist on stoking the fire in the main room through the night, leaving his own small stove in the barn cold. She knew he was sleeping out there now, in the hayloft. He had made an excuse about needing to be closer to a pregnant cow, but she saw the way he shivered when he came in for coffee in the morning, a fine dusting of frost on his shoulders. The best blankets, 2 heavy wool quilts that had been stored in a cedar chest, appeared on her bed one morning. She had assumed they were his, a comfort he had reserved for himself. But there they were, a silent offering against the bitter cold. These gestures were a language she was slowly, reluctantly beginning to understand. They were not the actions of a monster lying in wait. They were the actions of a man who was enduring, and who was trying to help her endure as well. One evening, while cleaning the hearth, her small leather diary, which she had carelessly left on the mantel, slipped and fell. It landed open, the pages fluttering, before disappearing into a dark gap between the stone hearth and the floorboards. Her heart leaped into her throat. She knelt, her fingers scrabbling uselessly at the thin crack. It was gone, swallowed by the house itself. In its pages were all her fears, her resentments, her raw, unfiltered vow not to trust him. If he found it, if he read it, he would know the truth of her heart. For 2 days, she lived in a state of quiet panic. Every time he walked near the fireplace, she held her breath. Then, on the 3rd morning, she came downstairs to find the diary sitting squarely in the middle of the kitchen table. It was closed. There was no sign that it had been pried from its hiding place. The floorboards looked undisturbed. Levi was standing by the stove, his back to her, pouring coffee. He did not turn around. "Found it this morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The stone on the hearth is loose. I was fixing it." She stared at the book, Her hands clenched. She could not bring herself to ask the question that screamed in her mind. Had he read it? As if hearing her silent terror, he finally turned, a steaming mug in his hand. He looked at the diary, then at her, his gaze steady and direct. "What is private," he said, his voice even, "is yours to keep." He placed the mug on the table for her and walked out of the house, leaving her alone with her secrets, which he had held in his hands, and returned to her, unviolated. A wave of something hot and sharp washed over her, something that felt dangerously like shame, followed by a slow, creeping, and wholly unwanted sense of respect. He had been given the keys to her innermost thoughts and had chosen not to turn the lock. That night, a new kind of silence settled between them. It was not empty, but contemplative. They sat by the fire, the blizzard raging outside, creating a fragile pocket of warmth and peace in the heart of the storm. He was oiling a piece of tack, his large hands working the leather with a practiced, rhythmic motion. She was mending one of his shirts, the needle a small silver flash in the firelight. She did not plan it. The impulse rose from a place deeper than thought, a place of shared wounds. She wanted him to see. She needed him to see, to understand the source of the fear he so patiently endured. She set down her sewing, her hands trembling slightly. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she unfastened the top 2 buttons of her high-necked dress. It was a simple, modest garment, but the act felt more revealing than complete nakedness. With unsteady fingers, she pulled the fabric aside, exposing the sliver of skin just above her ribs on her left side. The firelight caught the scar, a pale, jagged line against the white of her skin, a permanent testament to a single, brutal night. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply sat there, her vulnerability laid bare in the warm, flickering light, and waited. Levi had stopped his work. His hands were still on the leather, but his gaze was fixed, first on the scar, then on her face. She expected to see pity in his eyes, or perhaps disgust, or even a flicker of morbid curiosity. She saw none of those things. His expression was one of profound, sorrowful understanding. He did not flinch. He put down the tack and moved from the hearth to kneel before her, just as he had done the night he had almost kissed her. This time, there was no tension in the air, only a heavy, shared grief. He did not reach for the scar. He did not touch the exposed skin. Instead, he gently took her right hand, the one that was not trembling, and lifted it to his lips. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the delicate skin of her wrist, his eyes closing for a brief moment. It was a gesture of reverence, an acknowledgement of her pain, an absolution she had not known she was seeking. He released her hand and returned to his seat on the hearth, picking up the piece of leather as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. In the quiet of the room, a confession had been made and accepted. A story of trauma told and honored without a single word being spoken. A long time passed, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind. It was Levi who finally broke the silence, his voice low and gravelly. "I was arrested once," he said, his eyes on the flames. "Spent a night in the cell in Dry Creek." Clara looked up, surprised by the sudden, intimate disclosure. "It was over Eleanor," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "A man, a wealthy trapper passing through, saw her in town. He thought she was for sale. He approached me later, in the saloon, offered me a sum of money for an evening with my fiancé. He spoke of her like she was a mare at an auction." He paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. "I did not say a word. I just hit him. I hit him until the sheriff and 2 other men pulled me off him. I think I would have killed him if they had not." He looked over at her, his eyes dark with the memory of his own violence. "They think love is possession out here. They think a wife, a fiancé, is a piece of property, something to be owned and traded and branded. I thought so too. Once, I thought my anger was a righteous thing, the act of a man protecting what was his. He shook his head, a small, weary gesture. But burying my brother, losing Eleanor, it taught me something. You cannot own a person. You cannot own a soul. All you can do is stand beside them and try to keep them safe. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw the full weight of his promise to her. I am done owning anything that breathes. The words settled in the space between them, a profound and startling truth. His gentleness was not a tactic. His patience was not a trick. It was a philosophy, born of immense pain. He was not trying to possess her. He was trying to set her free from the prison of her own past, even as he kept her within the walls of his ranch. The temperature dropped further that week. The nights were a bitter, penetrating cold that seeped through the log walls and settled deep in the bones. One night, the fire in the hearth dwindled to glowing embers, and Clara awoke in the darkness, shivering so violently her teeth chattered. The quilts were not enough. The cold was a predator, and it was closing in. Across the room, Levi slept in his chair, a single thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He had given her all the warmth the house had to offer. She lay there, listening to his steady breathing, her fear of the cold warring with her fear of him, the loneliness, the biting chill, the memory of his gentle kiss on her wrist. It all swirled together. She was so tired of being cold, so tired of being alone, so tired of being afraid. Slowly, she pushed back the quilts. The floor was like a sheet of ice against her bare feet as she padded across the room. She stood over him, a small, shivering ghost in the moonlight that filtered through the window. He looked younger in sleep. The hard lines of his face softened. The weariness smoothed away. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his shoulder. His eyes opened instantly, alert and clear. He did not move, just watched her, waiting. "I am cold," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the truth, but it was not the whole truth. She could have added more logs to the fire. Instead, she had come to him. She saw the question in his eyes, the hesitation. He did not misunderstand her. This was not desire. This was a plea for something far more basic. He shifted, making room for her on the edge of the bed she had abandoned. He lifted the quilts in a silent invitation. She slid beneath them, her body a tight, shivering knot, staying as far from him as she could. The mattress dipped as he lay down beside her, on top of the covers, still fully dressed except for his boots. "I am just so tired of being afraid," she whispered into the darkness. He hesitated for a long moment. Then he rolled onto his side, facing her. He reached out and pulled her gently against him. It was not a lover's embrace. It was the simple, profound act of one human being offering warmth to another. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling the quilts tight, and held her. He was a solid wall of heat at her back, a steady presence in the terrifying dark. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She leaned into him, into the warmth, and for the first time in years, she fell asleep in the arms of another person and was not afraid. When she woke, the morning light was pale and thin, and the room was warm. Sometime in the night, they had shifted, and she was now curled against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, his arms still securely around her. One of his large hands rested possessively on her waist. The intimacy of it sent a hot blush creeping up her neck. She was tangled with him, a man she barely knew, a man she had sworn to hate. Embarrassed, she tried to slip away, but his grip tightened in his sleep. He mumbled something incoherent, a name that sounded like Jacob, and pulled her closer. Her heart fluttered in panic, but then his breathing evened out again, and he was still. She lay there, trapped in his warmth, her cheek against the rough fabric of his shirt, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. It was a strangely peaceful sound, When he finally woke, he did not seem surprised or awkward to find her there. He simply blinked, his gaze clearing, and released her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He got up, stretched his stiff limbs, and went to stoke the fire, his movements calm and ordinary. He did not comment on where they had woken up. He did not even look at her in a way that suggested anything had changed. When she came downstairs later, washed and dressed, he was pulling a pan of cornbread from the oven. The kitchen was filled with the warm, sweet smell. He cut a thick slice for her and drizzled it with honey from a small jar, a rare luxury. He slid the plate across the table to her without a word, his actions speaking a language of simple, uncomplicated care that was more reassuring than any verbal promise could have been. The intrusion came 2 days later, a black carriage appearing like a specter against the vast whiteness of the snow. Clara watched it approach from the window, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Visitors were not a part of their world. A woman emerged, dressed head to toe in severe black bombazine, her face a pinched mask of old grief and fresh disapproval. She marched to the door and knocked, the sound sharp and demanding. When Clara opened it, the woman looked her up and down, her thin lips curling in contempt. "I am Agnes Bishop," she announced, her voice as brittle as ice. "Eleanor's mother. I have come to see my daughter's grave." Levi was out with Silas, checking traps along the creek bed. Clara was alone. "Of course," Clara said, her voice small. "Please, come in out of the cold." Agnes swept past her into the house, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, her expression souring further. She stopped before the fireplace, her gaze falling on Clara again. "So you are the one," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "The replacement. He did not waste much time sullying my daughter's memory, did he? And with a creature like you, I have heard the stories from town. A whore in white lace. They call you a damaged little thing my foolish Levi took on as some kind of charity case." The cruel words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. All her old shame, all her carefully buried insecurities, came rushing to the surface. She felt the familiar urge to shrink, to disappear, to become invisible. But then, something else rose up alongside the shame. It was a hot, fierce surge of anger. Anger at this woman, at the town, at the world that had branded her and cast her aside. She thought of Levi, of his quiet sacrifices, of his gentle respect. He had never once made her feel damaged. He had treated her with more decency than anyone in her entire life. And this woman was standing in their home, her home, and defiling it with her poison. Clara drew herself up to her full height, which was not very tall, but for the first time, she felt grounded, solid. Her hands were trembling, but her voice, when she spoke, was firm. "You are a guest here, Mrs. Bishop," she said, her tone level and cold. "You will show respect. You do not know me, and you will not speak to me that way in my own home." Agnes looked stunned, as if a kitten had just roared like a lion. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had expected a cowering, broken girl. She had not expected this. Clara walked to the door and held it open. "The grave is to the west of the house. You cannot miss it. Please pay your respects. Then I must ask you to leave." Agnes, sputtering with indignation, finally found her voice. But it was just a string of insults that Clara no longer heard. The woman stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Clara leaned against the closed door, her body shaking with the aftermath of the confrontation. And then the tears came. But they were not the tears of fear or shame she was so used to. They were hot, cleansing tears of rage. That was how Levi found her when he returned an hour later. She was sitting in the rocking chair, her face tear-stained, but her eyes were bright with a fire he had never seen before. He saw the carriage tracks leading away from the house and understood immediately. He knelt before her, his expression a mixture of concern and something else, pride. Clara," he said softly. "She called me a whore," she choked out, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "In our home." He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. He did not say he would go after Agnes. He did not promise violence or retribution. He just looked at her, at the fierce, defiant woman who had defended their life together, and his face was filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen there. He pulled her to her feet and wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly against his chest. This time, when he held her, she did not just accept the comfort. She clung to him, her arms wrapping around his strong back, burying her face in his shoulder. She was not a victim seeking a protector. She was a fighter seeking solace with her ally. He pulled back just enough to look down at her face, his hands framing her jaw. He searched her eyes, and this time, when he leaned in, she did not flinch. She did not close her eyes or turn away. She watched him come closer, a silent permission passing between them. Their first kiss was nothing like she had ever imagined a kiss could be. It was slow, hesitant, a question asked and answered in the soft pressure of lips. It was clumsy and intense and utterly quiet. It tasted of the cold winter air on his skin and the salt of her tears. It was not an act of possession or a prelude to a demand. It was a shared moment of profound, breathtaking tenderness. It was the end of a long, cold winter of the soul and the hesitant, fragile beginning of something like spring. Spring did not arrive with grace. It came in a torrent of mud and misery. The great thaw turned the ranch into a vast, sucking quagmire. The creek, which had been a frozen trickle all winter, swelled into a brown, angry roar, flooding the low-lying pastures. The snow melted away to reveal the skeletons of animals that had not survived the winter, and the air, once clean and cold, now carried the thick, loamy scent of decay and rebirth. With the thaw came new dangers. Wolves grew bolder, their howls drawing closer to the ranch each night, and with the damp, cloying air came sickness. It started with a single cow, then spread like a curse through the herd, a hacking cough, a fever that glazed their eyes, a weakness that left them unable to stand. Levi was transformed by the threat. The quiet, weary man was replaced by a grim warrior fighting a desperate, losing battle. He spent his days and most of his nights in the barn or out in the muddy fields, tending to the sick, separating them from the healthy. His face a mask of exhaustion and grim determination. He grew thin, the lines around his eyes deepening, his movements slowed by a bone-deep weariness. Clara watched him from the house, a helpless observer. She saw him stumble back long after midnight, covered in mud and the stench of sickness, only to fall into a chair for an hour before heading back out again. He was killing himself to save the herd, to save the very foundation of the life he had bled for. The line between his survival and the survival of his cattle was non-existent. One morning, she could bear it no longer. This was not his fight alone. It was hers, too. She had defended their home with her words. Now she would defend it with her hands. She put on a pair of Levi's old trousers she found in a trunk, tucking them into a sturdy pair of boots. The clothes were far too big, but they were practical. She tied her hair back and marched out to the barn. Levi was in a pen with a newborn calf, trying to coax it to take milk from its ailing mother. The calf was weak, its legs trembling. He looked up as she entered, his face a mixture of surprise and disapproval. "Go back to the house, Clara," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "There is sickness here." "I am aware," she replied, her own voice steady. "You cannot do this alone. Show me what to do." He started to argue, but the exhaustion in his eyes was too great. He looked at her, standing there in his oversized clothes, small and determined, and a long, weary sigh escaped him. He gave a curt nod toward a bucket. "We mix warm water with molasses and a bit of whiskey. It gives them strength. Try to get this one to drink." The work was brutal. It was heavy and filthy and heartbreaking. She learned to ignore the stench, the mud that caked her clothes and hair, the ache in her back and arms. She learned to hold a struggling calf, to force medicine down its throat, to clean the filth from the pens. She was not strong, not in the way Levi was, but she was relentless. One afternoon, Levi was struggling to move a sick cow, his muscles straining, his face pale with fatigue. Nearby, its calf, only a few weeks old, was stumbling, in danger of being trampled. Without a thought, Clara moved in. She braced herself, wrapped her arms around the calf's belly, and with a grunt of pure, focused effort, she lifted the small animal, its spindly legs kicking weakly. She carried it a few feet to a pen of clean straw, her arms burning with the strain. She set the calf down and turned, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Levi was staring at her. He had stopped his own struggle and was just watching her, a look on his face she had never seen before. It was not just surprise, it was a flicker of deep, unguarded pride. He saw her then, not as a fragile bride or a damaged girl, but as a partner, a woman with a core of surprising, unyielding strength. He said nothing, but the look was enough. It was a silent acknowledgement that she belonged here, not as property, but as a part of the fight. In the shared crucible of their labor, a new intimacy bloomed. The tentative connection forged in the winter darkness now grew in the harsh light of spring. It was a slow-burning tension, a constant, humming awareness of each other. Their world was the ranch, their language the shared work, and the quiet moments between. Touches that had once been accidental now lingered. When he passed her a bucket in the narrow aisle of the barn, his fingers would brush against hers, and for a fraction of a second, neither of them would pull away. When she stood on a stool to reach a high shelf, he would place a hand on the small of her back to steady her, and the warmth of his palm would seem to sear through the fabric of her dress. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the last of the sun bleed from the sky, she saw Silas watching them from the corral, boldly. She reached out and took Levi's hand, her small fingers twining with his. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her, and a slow, small smile touched his lips for the first time. He squeezed her hand, a silent, possessive gesture that felt not like ownership, but like a promise. The sickness finally broke as the weather warmed, but it left the herd and Levi decimated. They had lost nearly a third of their cattle. The financial loss was a heavy blow, but they had survived. They had survived it together. One night, a warm spring rain began to fall. A gentle, drumming sound on the roof that washed the last of the winter dust from the air. They had just finished a long, grueling day, helping a cow through a difficult birth. They were both soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and utterly exhausted. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. Levi built a fire while Clara lit the lamps. They moved in a comfortable, familiar silence. She went to the bedroom, her bedroom, and began to unbutton her filthy, rain-soaked dress. She was so tired, her muscles aching, that she did not even think about modesty. She just wanted to be clean and dry. She peeled off the wet layers and stood before the small fire Levi had lit in the bedroom hearth, her back to the room. The warmth of the flames on her skin was a blessing. She was wearing only her thin cotton chemise, and she stood there, letting the heat chase the chill from her bones, her eyes closed. She heard Levi enter the room and stop. She knew, without turning, that he was looking at her. She could feel the intensity of his gaze on her bare back. He was looking at her shoulders, the curve of her spine, and the pale, jagged line of her scar, stark against her skin in the firelight. The old panic, the familiar shame, flickered deep within her. The instinct was to cover herself, to hide the flawed, damaged part of her, but she fought it down. She thought of the woman she had been, cowering and afraid, and she thought of the woman she was becoming, the one who could lift a calf, who could face down a cruel old woman, who could work beside this man as an equal. She did not cover herself. She did not run. Slowly, deliberately, she turned to face him. Her heart was a wild bird in her chest, but her gaze was steady. She stood before him in the firelight, her body revealed, her scars, both visible and invisible, laid bare. It was an offering, a surrender. But this time, it was a surrender on her own terms. It was a choice. "Levi," she whispered, her voice husky. He looked as if he had been struck. He stood frozen, his eyes filled with a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored her own. He saw her fear, her courage, and her silent question. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he stood before her, so close she could feel the heat of his body. He raised a trembling hand and gently, so gently, traced the line of her scar with the tip of his finger. His touch was not one of pity, but of reverence. It was as if he were touching a sacred wound. "Clara," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. Their love-making was not the stuff of romance novels. It was not a grand, sweeping passion. It was a fragile truce signed in the heart of a long war. It was slow, and it was full of hesitations. His hands, so sure and steady on a horse or a tool, trembled as they explored her skin. He moved with an agonizing caution, terrified of frightening her, of breaking the fragile trust she was offering him. There were whispered apologies, his and hers, for old pains and new awkwardness. It was raw, and it was clumsy. Two broken people, scarred by life in different ways, trying to learn a language their bodies had never been taught. There were tears. Hers were a quiet, cleansing release of years of pent-up fear and loneliness. His were a single, silent drop that traced a path through the dust on his cheek, a tear for all that he had lost and for this beautiful, terrifying thing he was finally finding. But it was love. Of that, she was certain. It was not conquest. It was not possession. It was a quiet, desperate, and profoundly beautiful act of mutual healing. In his arms, in the warm, fire-lit darkness, Clara finally understood that a man's touch did not have to be a weapon. It could also be a comfort. It could be a home. It was a prayer whispered in the dark, and for the first time, she felt that someone was listening. The next morning, she awoke to the sound of a meadowlark singing outside the window. She was curled in Levi's arms, her head on his chest, the heavy wool blanket tangled around them. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was filled with a soft, gray light. A feeling of peace so deep and unfamiliar settled over her that she did not recognize it at first. Then she realized what it was. It was a complete and total absence of fear. She smiled. It was a real smile, a slow, gentle curve of her lips that reached all the way to her eyes. She could not remember the last time she had truly smiled. Levi stirred, his arms tightening around her. He opened his eyes, and his gaze was clear and warm. He looked at her smiling face, and his own hard features softened. "Good morning, wife," he said. The word, which had once sounded like a business term, was now filled with a quiet, profound intimacy. It was a declaration. The rumors in Dry Creek did not die. They festered, on their next trip to town for supplies. The whispers still followed them, but they were different now, laced with a crude, knowing curiosity. Clara kept her head held high, Levi's hand a warm, steady presence on the small of her back. As they were leaving, Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a weary expression, stopped them on the boardwalk. "Levi," he said, nodding a greeting. "Ma'am?" He looked uncomfortable. "Folks are talking about your wife's past, about that business in Willow Creek." Levi's face did not change. His body did not tense. He simply met the sheriff's gaze, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, quiet, and utterly devoid of heat, which made it all the more chilling. "Sheriff," he said, his tone conversational. "My wife's past is her own, but her present and her future are with me. If I hear of any man in this town, or any other, speaking of Clara with anything less than the respect she is due as Mrs. McAllister, they will not be answering to you. They will be answering to me. Is that understood?" The sheriff swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked from Levi's implacable face to Clara's quiet dignity. "Understood, Levi," he mumbled, and quickly found a reason to be somewhere else. As they rode home, Clara looked out at the vast, sprawling landscape. The hills were turning a soft, hopeful green. Wildflowers were beginning to push their way through the hard-packed earth. For so long, this place had been a prison, a desolate landscape of her own private hell. But now, sitting beside the silent, solid man who was her husband, a man who had faced down her demons with her, she saw it differently. The scorched fields were a place where new life could grow. The dry creeks were paths that could lead to unexpected places. The howling wind was not a lonely cry, but a song of survival. She reached out and placed her hand on Levi's knee, and when he looked at her, she gave him another small, true smile. This life, she realized with a sudden, startling clarity, might not be a punishment after all. It might just be a beginning. The hard-won piece of spring was a fragile thing. The ranch, scarred but surviving, began to heal under the warm sun. The grass grew thick and green. The surviving cattle grew fat, and a sense of weary hope settled over the small valley. Clara and Levi had settled into a rhythm, a partnership forged in mud and sickness. They worked side by side, their days filled with the hard, satisfying labor of rebuilding, their nights filled with a quiet, deepening intimacy. The house no longer felt like a prison, but a sanctuary. The men arrived on a Tuesday, just before noon. There were 3 of them, riding fine horses and dressed in clothes that were a little too clean for the trail. They presented themselves as cattle buyers from Cheyenne, looking to expand a new herd. The leader was a man with a slick smile and restless eyes named Henderson. He did the talking, his voice smooth and confident, while his 2 companions, rougher, quieter men, surveyed the ranch with a proprietary air that set Clara's teeth on edge. Levi was cautious, his natural stoicism serving as a formidable negotiating tool. He met Henderson's smooth talk with clipped, practical answers, his eyes missing nothing. Clara brought them water on the porch, and she felt Henderson's gaze linger on her a moment too long. An appraisal that had nothing to do with her being the rancher's wife and everything to do with her being a woman alone. A cold knot of unease formed in her stomach. These were not honest men. "A fine spread you have here, McAllister," Henderson said, gesturing vaguely at the valley. "A bit remote. Must be hard to hold on to." There was a subtle threat coiled beneath the pleasant words. "I hold on to what is mine," Levi replied, his voice flat. They walked the pastures for an hour, discussing bloodlines and prices. It was all a performance. The final act began when they returned to the main corral. Henderson made a ridiculously low offer. Levi simply shook his head. "I think you will reconsider," Henderson said, his smile vanishing. In a movement as smooth and quick as a striking snake, he drew a pistol from beneath his coat. His 2 companions did the same. "We are not here to buy your cattle, McAllister. We are here to take them." In that instant, Levi moved. He did not reach for his own gun. His first and only instinct was her. He shoved Clara backward, putting his body squarely between her and the men. "Get in the house!" he roared, his voice a command she did not dare disobey. A shot exploded in the quiet afternoon air. It was deafening. Levi grunted, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and stumbled sideways. A dark stain blossomed on his left shoulder, spreading rapidly through the fabric of his shirt. He did not fall, but he staggered, his own pistol now in his hand, his face a mask of white-hot fury and agony. Clara screamed his name. For a heart-stopping moment, she was frozen, the old, paralyzing terror threatening to consume her. She saw the smoking gun in Henderson's hand, the cruel smirk on his face. She saw Levi, wounded, trying to raise his own weapon, his left arm hanging useless at his side. Then, something inside her snapped. The fear did not vanish. It was a cold, hard stone in her gut, but a new feeling, a rage so pure and powerful it burned away everything else. Rose to meet it. This was her home. That was her husband. And these men would not take anything else from them. She turned and ran, not away, but toward the house. The men laughed, thinking she was fleeing. "Let the little bird go," Henderson sneered, turning his attention back to the wounded lion before him. Clara burst through the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Above the cold stone fireplace rested Levi's shotgun. It was heavy, a beast of a weapon, far bigger and more awkward than she had imagined. Her hands shook as she lifted it from its pegs. She fumbled with the shells on the mantel, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. She broke the gun open, slid 2 shells into the barrels, and snapped it shut with a loud, final click. She moved back to the doorway, the stock of the shotgun pressed hard against her own shoulder, the long, twin barrels trembling in her grip. Through the open door, she saw them advancing on Levi, who was leaning against a fence post, still on his feet, but pale and swaying. She did not aim. She did not think. She pulled back both triggers. The shotgun erupted with a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The kickback slammed into her shoulder, sending a shock of pain through her body and knocking her backward a step. The blast of buckshot tore through the air, ripping into the wooden fence post just above Henderson's head, sending splinters flying. The 3 men cried out in shock, spinning around to face the house. Their faces were a comical picture of disbelief. The timid, ruined bride they had dismissed was standing in the doorway, a smoking shotgun in her hands, her face a mask of cold fury. "Get off this land!" she screamed, her voice raw and shaking, but filled with an authority that stunned them, and stunned herself. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Henderson, his face pale, realized their advantage was gone. A wounded man was one thing, a wild woman with a shotgun was another. He cursed, firing a single wild shot in her direction that went wide, then turned and ran for his horse. His men, needing no further encouragement, followed suit. They scrambled into their saddles and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and the ringing silence in their wake. Clara did not lower the shotgun until they were out of sight. Then, it slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering onto the wooden porch. She ran to Levi. He was slumped against the fence, his face ashen, his eyes glazed with pain. "Clara," he whispered, his voice a thread. "Did they—" "They are gone," she said, her hands fluttering over his wound, afraid to touch it. "You are bleeding. We have to get you inside." With her help, he staggered into the house and collapsed into a chair. The next few hours were a blur of desperate, focused activity. She cut away his shirt, her stomach lurching at the sight of the torn flesh. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his shoulder, a blessing that had probably saved his life. She washed the wound with whiskey, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the bottle. He bit down on a piece of leather to keep from crying out, his knuckles white. She packed the wound with clean linen and bound it tightly, her movements clumsy but determined. When she was done, he was shivering, his skin clammy. "We have to go to town," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "The sheriff, we have to report this." "You cannot ride," she protested. "I can," he insisted, his jaw set in a stubborn line that she knew was unbreakable. The journey to Dry Creek was a nightmare. She hitched the wagon and helped him onto the seat, his face contorted in agony with every jolt. By the time they arrived, he was on the verge of collapse, a fever beginning to burn in his eyes. Sheriff Brody listened to their story, his face growing paler with each detail. When Levi described Henderson, the sheriff shifted his weight and avoided their eyes. "That sounds a lot like Caleb Finch," he said, his voice low. He glanced around the empty office, as if afraid of being overheard. "He runs with a rough crowd." "Then arrest him," Levi demanded, his voice weak but laced with steel. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. "It is not that simple. Levi, Caleb, he is the mayor's nephew." The air in the small, dusty office grew thick with a corrupt, suffocating silence. The law, which was supposed to be a shield for men like Levi, was nothing more than a tool for the powerful. Levi stared at the sheriff, his face a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated fury. He tried to push himself to his feet, to argue, to fight, but the fever and the pain were too much. He slumped back against the chair, a low groan escaping his lips. "I am taking you home," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. She helped him out of the office and back to the wagon, leaving the sheriff to his own cowardice. The fever took hold that night. Levi was lost to a world of pain and shadow, his strong body shivering uncontrollably beneath the quilts. For 3 days, Clara did not sleep. She sat by his bedside, a constant, vigilant presence. She bathed his face with cool water, forced broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and cleaned and redressed his wound, which was hot and angry to the touch. In his delirium, the walls he had built around his heart crumbled. He muttered and tossed, his mind trapped in the past, and she became the sole keeper of his broken confessions. "Jacob," he would whisper, his eyes wide with an old horror. "Should have been me. You were never as fast. I saw him draw. Should have been me." He would thrash in the bed, his good arm flailing. "So cold. The ground was so cold. I am sorry, brother. I am so sorry." Tears would stream down his face, the silent, agonizing tears of a man drowning in a guilt he had carried alone for years. Clara would wipe them away, her own heart aching with a fierce, protective love. Then he would call another name. "Eleanor, the babe. I should have protected you. He had no right to touch you." He would clench his fists. "I should have killed him. Then the other one, the one who, I am sorry. I failed you both. My fault. It is always my fault." Clara sat in the dim lamplight, listening to the raw, unfiltered pain of his soul. She finally understood. His silence was not a lack of feeling. It was a prison built of guilt. He saw himself as a failure, a man who could not protect the people he loved. His brother, his fiancée, her unborn child. And now, he believed he had failed to protect her. The weight of it all had been crushing him, turning his heart to stone. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He woke to find her asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting on her arms. When she opened her eyes and saw him looking at her, his gaze clear for the first time in days, a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. As he began to heal, a new resolve hardened within her. Levi had fought for her. He had taken a bullet for her. The town, the law, the mayor, they had all abandoned him. She would not. 2 days later, she hitched the wagon and drove to town alone. She walked into the sheriff's office, her back straight, her expression determined. Sheriff Brody looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening in surprise. "Mrs. McAllister," he stammered. "Sheriff," she said, her voice calm and even, betraying none of the fear that fluttered in her stomach. "I am here about the men who attacked my husband and my ranch. I assume warrants have been issued for their arrest." He cleared his throat, shuffling papers. "Now, ma'am, as I explained to your husband, this is a delicate situation." "It is not a delicate situation," she interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses like a knife. "It is a simple one. A crime was committed. A man was shot. You are the law. It is your duty to arrest the men responsible." "My hands are tied," he whined. The mayor? The mayor, Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, steely tone, is an elected official, as is the territorial governor in Cheyenne. If Caleb Finch and his associates are not in this jail by the end of the week, a letter will be on its way to the governor. It will detail the attack on our property, the theft of our livestock, my husband's injury, and your reluctance to perform your duties due to certain family connections here in Dry Creek. I imagine the governor will find it all very interesting. The sheriff stared at her, his jaw slack. The frightened little bride was gone. In her place stood a woman of iron and fire. He saw in her eyes that this was not a bluff. She would do it, and a letter to the governor would be the end of his career. He deflated, all the weak excuses and bluster draining out of him. I will see what I can do, he mumbled. You will do more than that. Sheriff, Clara said, turning to leave. You will do your job. 2 days later, Silas rode back from town with the news. Caleb Finch and his 2 companions were in jail. When Clara told Levi, he simply looked at her, his eyes shining with an emotion that left her breathless. He reached out with his good hand and pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick. As he grew stronger, they spent the long, quiet afternoons on the porch. The ranch was healing, and so were they. One day, as they watched the sun set, he finally spoke of what his fever had revealed. I used to think love, he began, his voice hesitant, or feeling anything, really was a weakness, a vulnerability, something the world could use to get to you, to break you. He looked out at the grave of his brother, a silent testament to his greatest pain. When you have lost enough, you learn to stop wanting things. It hurts less. He turned to her, his gaze intense and full of a new, unguarded honesty. I was wrong, pushing it all down, living behind a wall that does not keep you safe. It just turns you into stone. The day those men came, my only thought was of you. And when you stood in that doorway with that shotgun, you were the fiercest, most beautiful thing I have ever seen. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. Loving you, Clara, it does not make me weak. I think it is the only thing that is keeping me human. The next day, Silas brought a small, spindly sapling back from a trip to a neighboring town. It was a peach tree. Together, she and Levi chose a spot for it, in a sunny, protected corner of the yard near the house. They dug the hole together, his one good arm working alongside her too. They lowered the young tree into the earth, its roots a fragile promise. They packed the soil around it and gave it water. A peach tree would not bear fruit for years. It was not an act of survival. It was an act of faith. It was their silent promise to the future, a future they now believed they would have together. Later that evening, as dusk settled, Clara caught her reflection in the glass of the kitchen window. She saw a woman she barely recognized. Her face was thinner, tanned by the sun. Her hands were calloused, but it was her eyes that were different. The haunted, timid look was gone. In its place was a quiet strength, a steady confidence. She was still afraid sometimes. The world was still a dangerous place, but now she knew that she was also brave. That night, the sky was a vast canopy of brilliant, shimmering stars. The air was warm and smelled of damp earth and new leaves. Levi laid a blanket in the yard, near their newly planted tree. They lay down together, side by side, looking up at the infinite darkness. This time, when he turned to her, when his lips met hers, it was different. It was not about healing. It was not about seeking comfort from a storm. It was a celebration. Their lovemaking under the stars was slow, confident, and deeply connected. It was the quiet, joyful joining of two souls who had been dragged through hell and had found their salvation not in escaping it, but in facing it together. They were no longer two broken halves. They were whole. The summer bled into a long, golden autumn. The sun lost its cruel edge, and the wind that swept down from the mountains carried the crisp, clean scent of pine and distant snow. The passage of the seasons was marked not in the pages of a calendar, but in the rhythm of the ranch, a rhythm that now beat in Clara's own blood. The woman who had arrived in a jolting wagon, a fragile ghost in a black morning dress, was gone. In her place was a woman of the land. She learned to ride, not side saddle like a lady, but astride a sturdy mare, her borrowed trousers tucked into her boots. She learned the heft of an axe, the sting of a rope burn, the satisfying ache in her muscles after a day of mending fences. Her skin, once pale and translucent, was now tanned by the sun, and her hands, once soft and accustomed to needlepoint, were now calloused and capable. She moved with a purpose that was born not of fear, but of necessity, and a quiet, growing confidence. Even old Silas, who had first seen her as a fragile burden for his boss, now treated her with a gruff, earned respect. He would seek her out for advice on the chickens or the garden, and he listened when she spoke. She was no longer just the rancher's wife. She was the ranch's mistress in the truest sense of the word. She ran it beside Levi, a partner in his labors, a counsel in his worries. Their love had settled from a fragile, hesitant thing into a deep, unshakable foundation. It was a quiet love, expressed not in grand pronouncements, but in 1,000 small, daily acts. It was in the way he brought her the first wildflowers of spring, a clumsy fistful of purple and yellow. It was in the way she mended his favorite jacket, reinforcing the seams against the coming winter. It was in a shared glance across a field, a lingering touch as they passed in the narrow hallway, a comfortable silence on the porch at the end of a long day. The ghosts that had haunted the house, the faint scent of another woman's perfume, the shrouded mirrors, they had all faded, replaced by the vibrant, living presence of their shared life. One afternoon, the mail rider, a rare and welcome sight, brought a letter. It was addressed to Levi, the handwriting an elegant, spidery script on fine, cream-colored paper that looked utterly out of place in the dusty Wyoming territory. Levi took it, his expression hardening as he recognized the writing. He stood on the porch, turning the unopened envelope over and over in his hands as if it were a venomous thing. "It is from my mother," he said, his voice a low, tight knot of old anger. Clara came to stand beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. She knew the story. His mother had never approved of his move west, had seen it as a betrayal of their respectable life back in Ohio. After Jacob's death, she had written a cruel, grieving letter, blaming Levi, blaming the savage land he had chosen. He had not spoken to her since. "What does she want?" Clara asked softly. "I do not know," he said, his jaw tight. "And I do not care." He made a move to toss the letter into the yard, to let the wind and the dirt claim it. "Levi, wait," Clara said, her grip on his arm tightening. You do not have to read it now, but do not throw it away. Anger is a heavy thing to carry for so long." He looked down at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and the rigid line of his shoulders softened. He let out a long, slow breath and handed her the letter. "You read it," he said. She opened the envelope, her fingers careful. The letter was short, the elegant script marred by what looked like the faint, watery stains of tears. It was not a letter of demands or accusations. It was a plea. His mother wrote of her loneliness, of her regret. She wrote that she was old, and that the silence between them was a greater burden than her grief. She asked for his forgiveness. Clara read the words aloud, her voice soft and steady. When she was finished, a heavy silence hung in the autumn air. Levi stared out at the distant mountains, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "She blamed me for Jacob's death," he said, his voice rough. "She was grieving," Clara replied. "Grief makes people cruel. It makes them say things they do not mean. Look at the words she wrote. Levi, not the ones from years ago. The ones she wrote today. That is a mother asking for her son." He said nothing for a long time. Finally, he took the letter from her hand and walked into the house. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had first seen his quiet acts of kindness, and with a pen and a piece of simple paper, he began to write back. The past had a way of refusing to stay buried. A few weeks later, on a trip to Dry Creek for winter supplies, it rose up to meet them. Levi was inside the trading post, negotiating the price of salt blocks, while Clara waited on the boardwalk, enjoying the rare feeling of the sun on her face. A shadow fell over her, and a voice she had prayed she would never hear again sent a jolt of ice through her veins. "Well, well, look what we have here, little Clara, all grown up." She turned, her heart seizing in her chest. It was him, Thomas Webb, the blacksmith's son from her old town. He was leaner than she remembered, his face harder, his eyes holding the same cruel, predatory light. He had been released from the jail where he had spent a short time for his assault on her, his sentence lightened by his father's standing in the community. Her first instinct, the old, ingrained instinct of a cornered animal, was to run, to find Levi, to hide. Her hands began to tremble. But then she met his eyes, and the trembling stopped. She saw the smirk on his face, the confident swagger. He expected her to be afraid. He was feeding on her fear, just as he had that night behind the saloon. And in that moment, she decided she would not give him another scrap of it. "What do you want, Thomas?" she asked, her voice cold and level. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Just saying hello. Heard you got married off. To that big rancher, McAllister. Heard he likes damaged goods." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant to intimidate, to remind her of his power over her. "Does he know what you are? Does he know how easily you bruise?" She did not back away. She stood her ground, her spine as straight and unyielding as a fence post. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze clear and unwavering. She saw him not as a monster from her nightmares, but as what he was, a small, pathetic man who could only feel strong by making others feel weak. At that moment, the door to the trading post swung open, and Levi stepped out. He took in the scene in an instant, the smirking man standing too close to his wife, the look of cold fury on Clara's face. Every muscle in Levi's body went rigid. His hand dropped, instinctively, to the worn leather handle of the pistol on his hip. A terrifying stillness settled over him, the promise of swift, lethal violence. But before he could take a step, before he could utter a word, Clara spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the afternoon air with the clean, sharp finality of a blade. "You do not own me," she said, her words directed solely at Thomas. "You never did." Thomas Webb's smirk faltered. He looked from her defiant face to the silent, deadly figure of her husband, and the last of his bravado evaporated. He was a bully, and he had just realized he was facing two people he could not break. He stammered something incoherent, then turned and practically fled down the street. Levi walked to her side, his hand leaving his gun to find hers. He searched her face, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective pride. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I am," she said, and she was surprised to find that it was the absolute truth. The encounter had not broken her. It had freed her. The confrontation had not gone unnoticed. Several townspeople on the boardwalk had witnessed the exchange. They had seen Thomas Webb's intimidation, and they had seen Clara's unshakable response. They had seen the silent, formidable presence of her husband standing behind her. The whispers that had followed her for so long in this town finally died that day. When people looked at her now, they no longer saw the damaged bride from the rumors. They saw Mrs. McAllister, a woman of strength and substance, a woman to be respected. On the ride home, Clara felt a lightness she had not experienced in years. The last of the shadows had been chased away, not by Levi's strength, but by her own. A few days later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Levi took her hand. "Come with me," he said. "There is a place I want to show you." He led her up the small, wind-swept hill that overlooked the ranch, the place she had only ever seen from a distance. There, enclosed by a simple wooden fence, was the single, weathered cross that marked his brother's grave. It was a stark, lonely place, but it was not without its own rugged beauty. From here, you could see the entire valley, the ranch house nestled below, the cattle grazing peacefully, the creek a silver ribbon in the fading light. Levi stood before the grave for a long time, his hat in his hands. Clara stood silently beside him, giving him the space he needed for his grief. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and thick, his words directed not at her, but at the silent ground before him. "Jacob," he began, "there is someone I want you to meet." He turned and looked at Clara, and the love in his eyes was so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He took her hand and gently pulled her forward. "This is Clara. She is my wife." He paused, swallowing hard against the emotion that clogged his throat. "I know I failed you, brother, and for a long time, I thought that was the end of my story, just a man on a lonely piece of land, waiting for the end." He looked back at Clara, his gaze holding hers. "But she is the reason I still believe there is something worth living for." He leaned in then, in the wind, with the vast, wild prairie stretching out around them in every direction, and he kissed her. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared sorrow, and of an unshakable, enduring love. It was a promise made not just to her, but to the past and to the future. The story ends not with that kiss, but in the quiet that followed. A week later, Clara sat on the porch in a rocking chair, the last of the evening light painting the sky in shades of rose and violet. The air was cool, and she had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. In her lap was her small, leather-bound diary. She was not writing, she was reading. She had turned back to the very first page, to the entry she had written on her first night in this house, a lifetime ago. "His kindness is a lie, a mask he wears. I will not be fooled by it. I will not forget what a man's touch feels like when the kindness runs out. I will not trust him. I will not." A slow smile touched her lips. She thought of the frightened, broken girl who had written those words, and she did not feel shame. She felt a deep, abiding compassion for her. She closed the book, the vow within it now nothing more than a memory of a ghost. She heard the familiar, heavy tread of his boots on the porch boards. Levi came and sat on the steps beside her chair, his back resting against the post. He reached up and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars begin to prick the darkening sky. "I am still afraid sometimes," she whispered into the quiet, the admission as easy and natural as breathing. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, his embrace tightening just enough to be a comfort. "Me too," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble against her ear. "But I am not leaving." They watched the last of the light fade from the world, the vast Wyoming sky turning to a deep, star-dusted velvet. They were no longer two lonely people fighting against the wilderness. They were the heart of it. They were home, and they were not alone. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments to connect with others. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.